Hello horse racing fans, and welcome to the Kentucky Derby Alphabet. In short, with almost 150 runnings of the Kentucky Derby, there's bound to be at least one winner of the Kentucky Derby for each alphabetical letter. Now there technically isn't, but we're pretty close. So in this video, we're going to highlight the best winner from each alphabetical letter. And with 25 of these to cover, I'm not wasting much time. Here is the Kentucky Derby Winners Alphabet. And with the intro done, it is time for the first letter of the alphabet, which has quite a few legendary names, but there can only be one spot per letter, and that choice goes to A, for Affirmed. Now considering that the letter A has 3 different Triple Crown winners, as well as the inaugural winner of the Kentucky Derby, Aristides, whoever you pick must be an amazing horse, and they don't get much better than Affirmed, even by Triple Crown standards. Both Assault and American Pharoah were certainly tough horses. Assault was able to prevail against Hall of Famer Stymie multiple times, even under strict weights, and American Pharoah has the unique honor of winning the Grand Slam. But none had the distinct honor of facing off against a horse as tough as Alydar. Without Alydar, Affirmed never got to show just how great he truly was. He raced against a horse that had the potential to win the Triple Crown almost any other year, and he faced off against him 10 separate times, winning 7 of them. And that was just as a 2- and 3-year-old. As a 4-year-old, he was arguably even better, only losing his first 2 races, and then going on to rattle off a winning streak that included 7 races, culminating by defeating Spectacular Bid in the Jockey Club Gold Cup. And Spectacular Bid, just like Alydar, could have won the Triple Crown, although this time it was just because of jockey error that he didn't win the Belmont Stakes. Still, in Affirmed's career, he raced against at least 2 horses that could be ranked in the top 20 for greatest racehorses of all time, and both horses that, under different circumstances, could have won the Triple Crown themselves, and Affirmed beat them, one of them multiple times. That is something that almost no other horse in history can claim to really do. And that seals the deal for me for putting Affirmed as the best Kentucky Derby winner, starting with the letter A. Next up, B for Big Brown. Now initially you might think Barbaro deserves to represent the letter B, however, everything Barbaro was able to do in his incredibly short career, Big Brown also did. Both ran in turf races as youngsters, then went on to win the Florida Derby and then the Kentucky Derby by multiple lengths. The only difference was Big Brown lasted longer on the track, and because of that, gets the edge here, as brutal and blunt as that sounds. On a slightly lighter note, Big Brown was certainly quite a horse. In his short career, he was able to win 2 jewels of the Triple Crown and frankly could have won the Belmont Stakes if it weren't for a quarter crack, a sunny day, and a loose shoe. And even after the infamous Belmont Stakes, he was able to regroup and win the Haskell Stakes in absolutely incredible fashion, and then defeat older horses on the turf. That kind of casual versatility you just don't see every day, especially from a Kentucky Derby and Preakness Stakes winner. And that makes me pretty confident in putting him as letter B. Letter C is another very divisive one, because there are 2 very great Triple Crown winners that start with the letter C, Count Fleet and Citation, and both did frankly freakish things, but I have to give the slight edge to Citation, because no horse until Cigar was able to equal Citation's 16-race winning streak, and even then, Cigar did not equal Citation's seasonal record of winning 19 races from 20 starts at the age of 3. That is something that you will never see again. And even after being injured for a full year and returning at the age of 5, it still took world beaters like the Hall of Fame racehorse Newer to defeat him. But the biggest thing he ever did was becoming the first racehorse in history to earn over $1 million. Nowadays, being a millionaire in horse racing isn't nearly as special, but to be the first horse ever to break $1 million is something that no other horse can take away from you. It is something truly special, and that's why some people say Citation is the 3rd greatest horse of all time. Some even say he's the greatest of all time, depending on the source. Either way you slice it, the letter C stands for Big Sigh. But as we transition over to letter D, things become a little harder to decide. When it comes to Kentucky Derby winners starting with the letter D, there aren't many standouts. Names like Now, Decidedly, or Dust Commander don't spark up memories of a legendary Kentucky Derby winner. But there is one that stands a bit above the other D Kentucky Derby winners. And that would be Determine, who also holds the sentiment of being the first gray horse to win the Kentucky Derby. While not necessarily a legendary racehorse, Determine had quite a great season as a 3-year-old, racing 15 times and winning 10 races. All of them were stakes races, and most of them were certainly in California. However, his win in the Kentucky Derby proved that he didn't need California to win. However, besides this, Determined does generally get overshadowed because in his 4-year-old season, he had the displeasure of racing against the legendary Swaps. But if you look past his losses to Swaps, you can see that Determined was a very hardy racehorse, racing at least 14 times in each of his 3 seasons on the track. But that was just him on average. As a 3-year-old, he was honestly a rather underappreciated freak with all the races he was able to win in such a short amount of time. So while in general the letter D hasn't produced the best when it comes to Kentucky Derby winners, I feel Determined still deserves a spot here as the letter D. The letter E is the most commonly used word in the English language, appearing in 11% of all English words. Ironically though, only 2 horses starting with the letter E have won the Kentucky Derby. First was Elwood, who won the Kentucky Derby in 1904 and became the first Kentucky Derby winner owned and bred by a woman. But the easy choice for the best Kentucky Derby winner that started with the letter E is the other one, Exterminator, also known as Old Bones, a nickname that he acquired thanks to an incredibly long racing career that consisted of 99 races and a mythological 100th race that never happened. Even without that 100th race, he was able to win 50 of his races exactly on the dot, which is more than any other Kentucky Derby winner. The closest any Kentucky Derby winner has gotten to matching Exterminator's 50 wins was Old Rosebud, who won 40, and even that is still 10 less than the mighty Exterminator, so for being the most winning Kentucky Derby winner, it's a pretty easy choice. But letter F does have some debate. There's Fusaichi, Pegasus, and Funnyside, who never really replicated their form after the Triple Crown races. There's Ferdinand, who was the 1987 Horse of the Year, and also won the Breeders' Cup Classic, but I think the one I'm gonna go with is Foolish Pleasure. He's the only one of the F Kentucky Derby winners to have made it into the Hall of Fame, and there is some good reason for that. Foolish Pleasure was more than just an ill-fated match race. Going into the 1975 Kentucky Derby, he had won 10 of 11 races, which included multiple Grade 1 races, and even after winning the Kentucky Derby, he was game to be second in both the Preakness and the Belmont Stakes, which isn't too shabby if I say so myself. As well as that, after the Triple Crown Series, he managed to beat multiple different Hall of Famers, such as Ancient Title, who was a legendary California bred, and the mighty Forgo, although Forgo did later get his revenge. And the only 3-year-old that could really trifle him, and eventually did deny him the honor of champion 3-year-old, was the Great Wajima. He was a great horse, amplified by the fact that he ran against a very tough generation of 70s racehorses. So with all that said, I think it's pretty safe to say that F stands for Foolish Pleasure in this Kentucky Derby alphabet. The letter G has 2 major standouts. First is Genuine Risk, who became just the second of 3 fillies to win the Kentucky Derby, and also managed to be second in both the Preakness and the Belmont afterwards. But the other one didn't just finish second in the Preakness and the Belmont Stakes, he won them. Gallant Fox, who just like Genuine Risk, was the second horse to do something, and his something was being the second American Triple Crown winner after Sir Barton. As a 2-year-old, he did struggle a bit, only winning 2 of 7 races. However, his 2 victories were both stakes races, a sign of things to come. As a 3-year-old, though, he was certainly something else. His season that year featured 10 separate races with 9 career victories, the highlight of which being the Triple Crown Series. But there were some interesting facts about that faithful Kentucky Derby that he did win. He actually won the Preakness 8 days before the Kentucky Derby. Because when he won the Preakness, Kentucky Derby, and Belmont Stakes, the Triple Crown just hadn't been coined yet. But after this, and his son Omaha both completing the Triple Crown, it eventually became a major staple. As well as that, the 1930 Kentucky Derby was the first to feature starting gates. A great year of racing to be sure for Gallant Fox, however, his one blunder as a 3-year-old will probably be more famous than any of his other achievements. In the Travers Stakes, he lost to a 100-to-1 shot named Jim Dandy, one of the greatest upsets in horse racing history. But despite that loss, Gallant Fox was untouchable as a 3-year-old, with the Kentucky Derby being his biggest victory of all. And so, the letter G stands for the Fox of Bel Air, Gallant Fox. For the letter H, we will have to go very far back in time to talk about our next representative, and that would be Hindu, who won the Kentucky Derby all the way back in 1881. There ain't much to really show when it comes to replays or anything, just a couple of artist portraits that you see in front of you, but Hindu's record was incredibly impressive. As a 3-year-old, he had a winning streak of 18 consecutive victories, which included the Kentucky Derby, and overall that season, he had 18 wins from 20 starts, just one off from the Great Citation. Even though he didn't reach those heights again as a 4-year-old, by the end of his career, Hindu had won 30 of his 35 races and was never worse than third. Not something that many horses today can claim to do. And even though some of his achievements might be a little dated, his simple ability to win over and over again is still an incredible achievement. And then on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, we jump up 141 years to the 2012 Kentucky Derby winner, I'll Have Another, who has probably the cutest origin story for a name, as that was the response that his owner would give to his wife when she asked if he wanted another cookie. Ain't that sweet? And so was I'll Have Another. In just 7 races, he captured 3 Grade 1 wins, including the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness, and he could have won the Triple Crown if it weren't for a tendon injury the Friday before the Belmont Stakes, becoming the first horse since Bold Venture in 1936 to win the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness and not race in the Belmont. And as unfortunate as that was, it would have been more unfortunate if he was forced to race anyway. And while I absolutely hate that it happened, I'll Have Another does have a special place in my heart, as the 2012 Kentucky Derby was the first time I ever tried hosting a Kentucky Derby party. And you know what? I haven't missed a year since. So I gotta thank you, I'll Have Another, for giving me a great first party. I was just 7 years old when he raced, and now, 10 years later, I still love the Kentucky Derby. If that weren't plainly obvious already by me making a 20-minute video about it. For letter J, I was briefly considering talking about Johnstown, the winner of the 1939 Kentucky Derby and Belmont Stakes, and winner of 14 of 21 races overall during his career, as well as a Hall of Famer. But then I realized that there's also Justify, and you can't really argue with a Triple Crown winner. While Justify only had 5 months on the racetrack and 6 overall starts, he was an absolute freak, taking 4 Grade 1 races in that time, and well, the Triple Crown. There's not much better than the Triple Crown. Even if I wish he could have ran longer, the brief time that he was on the track was definitely a blast. Next we got letter K, and letter K is the first of quite a few letters later down the line that don't really got many Kentucky Derby winners. There's only 2 horses starting with the letter K that have won the Kentucky Derby, which is ironic considering, well, what letter does Kentucky Derby start with? And the 2 options that we got are Kingman, who ran the slowest Kentucky Derby of all time, and Kauai King. So I think it's pretty obvious who we're going to pick here. Kauai King is probably one of the least well-known Triple Crown near misses, mainly because of the fact that he was a product of some luck. And by some luck, I mean having the best 3-year-old that year be taken out of the Triple Crown series due to injury. That being the famous Buck Passer. So instead, Kauai King took over and won both the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness, with the only blunder being a 4th in the Belmont Stakes, which isn't too shabby, and going into the Kentucky Derby he already had a decent foundation of victories. But when Buck Passer returned, Kauai King failed to defeat him and ended up being injured and retired. So, far from the best record we've seen from a Kentucky Derby winner, but when your opponent ran the slowest Kentucky Derby in history, it ain't too hard to represent the letter K. And as a little fun fact, Kauai King is currently the only Maryland-bred horse ever to win the Kentucky Derby. And then on to letter L, which stands for Leonatus, a name that has gained a little bit of popularity recently thanks to a new Kentucky Derby contender in Taiba, who goes into this Kentucky Derby with just 2 career starts, the same thing that Leonatus did before entering the Kentucky Derby all the way back in 1883. However, since Leonatus did win the Kentucky Derby, no other horse has been able to replicate what he did. Now, Taiba has a shot, but the question is, can he really do what the great Leonatus did? Well, probably not exactly, because after Leonatus won his 2nd consecutive race, which was the Kentucky Derby, he would extend his winning streak all the way to 10 straight before retiring. His only career defeat was his lone start at the age of 2. At the age of 3, he was an invincible machine. So Taiba will have big shoes to fill if he's going to want to compete with the letter L, Leonatus. For the letter M, we weirdly enough have 2 peas in a pod, that being undefeated Kentucky Derby winners. First we have Morvich, who going into the Kentucky Derby was undefeated in 11 races, all of which he ran in as a 2-year-old, and then we have Majestic Prince, who was undefeated in 7 races, and will be our representative for the letter M for a couple of reasons, such as also winning the Preakness Stakes, but it wasn't against just nobody, it was against 1969's Horse of the Year, Arts and Letters, who just like Majestic Prince is currently standing in the Hall of Fame, and for good reason. After the Triple Crown was over, Arts and Letters took over the 3-year-old World Division, taking the Jim Dandy, the Travers, the Woodward, and the Jockey Club Gold Cup, just to name a few, as well as Horse of the Year. But when Majestic Prince was at his best, he handed Arts and Letters 2 separate defeats by gallant necks. The only thing that stopped Majestic Prince from truly revealing his full potential was because of selfishness, because his owner, against the wishes of his trainer Johnny Longden, ran him in the 3rd jewel of the Triple Crown because of immense public pressure, even though Johnny Longden had stated that Majestic Prince had an injury in his right foreleg. However, the injury wasn't bad enough for him to technically not race, but it was going to guarantee that he wasn't going to run at his best, and that's exactly what they got when Arts and Letters won by 5.5 lengths. He never raced again, and left everyone wondering just how great he could have been if they had given up the Triple Crown. And the Triple Crown near misses don't end just yet, as N stands for Northern Dancer, who on the racetrack was absolutely amazing, becoming the first Canadian bred ever to win the Kentucky Derby, as well as the only horse in history to win both the Kentucky Derby and the Queen's Plate, which for context, the Queen's Plate is the Canadian version of the Kentucky Derby, being the first jewel of the Canadian Triple Crown, and fun fact, the Queen's Plate is older than the Kentucky Derby, being inaugurated in 1860. And just like the Kentucky Derby, never missing a single running since then. But the best of them all was Northern Dancer. But as great as he was as a racehorse, Northern Dancer's real mark is as a stallion. While the list of champions that have been produced by Northern Dancer are too numerous to mention, a very short and simple way of describing just how influential he truly was as a stallion is by the simple mentioning of the fact that at least 80% of racehorses today can trace back to Northern Dancer. In fact, every single horse running in the 2022 Kentucky Derby can be traced back to Northern Dancer. Pretty safe to say that if every single horse running in the Kentucky Derby this year can be traced back to you, you deserve a spot in the Kentucky Derby alphabet. N is for Northern Dancer. But now that we've talked about 2 separate Triple Crown near misses, it's time to talk about an actual Triple Crown winner. O is for Omaha, and Omaha has quite a few unique features. For one, his father was Gallant Fox, who we previously talked about in the letter G, making Omaha the only son of a Triple Crown winner to also win the Triple Crown himself. Other than that, his other big feature was that at the age of 4, he was shipped to England to race, and he even managed 2 separate victories, including the Queen's Plate. And just for clarification, this is a completely different race from the Canadian one we talked about with Northern Dancer. They just happen to share the same name. But most impressively, even though he didn't win the race, he ran in the 2.5-mile Ascot Gold Cup and only lost by a nose. So not only is he a Triple Crown winner, he also came a nose away from winning the longest and one of the most prestigious English turf races ever. It's going to be a very long time before we see another Kentucky Derby winner, let alone a Triple Crown winner, do something like that in England ever again. For the letter P, I had quite a bit of trouble, like a lot more trouble than any of the other letters in here, because both Ponder and Pleasant Colony are great horses. Pleasant Colony would have been an easy choice because he's a Triple Crown near miss and also won the Wood Memorial and Woodward Stakes, but after, no pun intended, pondering on it for a bit, I decided to go with 3-year-old. He ran a whopping 21 times and still was able to win 9 of them, which included the Kentucky Derby, the American Derby, Salt. So even though he was far from the best horse in the late 40s and early 50s, he was still most certainly an example of just how great that crop was. And then we got the letter Q, which is a little awkward because no Kentucky Derby winner starts with the letter Q. But to make this more interesting, we'll try our best, and we'll go with the best finisher that started with the letter Q. And out of the 7 horses that have ran the Kentucky Derby with the letter Q, the best finishers were Quito in 1880 and Quadrangle in 1964. We're gonna go with Quadrangle because we know a bit more about him than Quito. And also because he played a rather significant role in the 1964 Triple Crown Series, winning the 1964 Belmont Stakes and denying Northern Dancer his Triple Crown. And even after he denied Northern Dancer his Triple Crown, he wasn't exactly done winning. By the end of his career, he had won 10 times, with his biggest win besides the Belmont being the 1964 Travers Stakes. So while technically not a Kentucky Derby winner, Q will stand for Quadrangle because, well, we don't got anything better. For the next 2 letters, it's kind of a double whammy. First up, letter R stands for Riva Ridge, winner of the 1972 Kentucky Derby and Belmont Stakes, as well as the lesser-known savior of Meadow Stud. While he doesn't get a lot of the spotlight, Riva Ridge certainly did a lot during his career, winning 17 of his 30 career races, or just over half. Which certainly ain't a shabby statistic considering he was running against such great horses as Key to the Mint, Kennedy Road, and Cougar 2. And one of his lesser-known achievements was that he broke the world record for 1.1 miles on the dirt in the 1973 Marlboro Cup. However, the reason why nobody knows about that is because there was one horse in that race who ran it even faster than Riva Ridge's record-setting run, and that was his stablemate, and letter S on our Kentucky Derby alphabet, the greatest racehorse of all time, Secretariat. Now, normally this is when I just go and spew out a bunch of facts, but everyone knows the facts about Secretariat. He still holds the record for the fastest Kentucky Derby, Preakness, and Belmont Stakes. His heart was twice as big as a normal horse. And in the Kentucky Derby specifically, he ran every quarter faster than the previous one. Most people generally know that, and there's a good reason for it. It's because we'll never see a horse do something like that again. Even after almost 50 years, no horse has been able to do anything remotely close to what Secretariat could do at his peak. Even in just the Marlboro Cup that I previously mentioned, he beat a horse who was running a world record race. He broke the new world record for 1.1 miles on the dirt while it was being run right in front of him, right on his side. I could go all day about Secretariat, but that's not really what this video is supposed to be about. It's about shining light on some of the best Kentucky Derby winners, especially ones that you may not have heard of, such as letter T, Tim Tam, the 1958 Kentucky Derby winner, who has quite an interesting story to tell. And it ain't just his racing career that's interesting, although Tim Tam certainly had quite a campaign. By the Belmont Stakes, his final race, he had raced 13 times just as a 3-year-old alone, and he had won 10 of them, which of course included the Kentucky Derby and also the Preakness Stakes. He could have won the Belmont Stakes, but unfortunately he fractured one of his legs in the stretch, and even with that injury, he was still able to finish second behind Cavan. And luckily for Tim Tam, the injury wasn't fatal, but it did end his racing career prematurely. Luckily though, it didn't end his legacy, and I'm not talking about his stud record, although that wasn't too shabby, but his legacy came through in, out of all things, chocolate biscuits. One of the people in the stands of the 1958 Kentucky Derby was a guy named Ross Arnett, who was trying to create his own chocolate biscuit company with a couple of other people. After watching Tim Tam win the Kentucky Derby, he thought Tim Tam would be a perfect name for a biscuit, and so he called his biscuits Tim Tams. Nowadays, Tim Tams are actually the most popular biscuit per capita, and most people don't even know that the name came from, out of all things, a racehorse. And now you know. As we move past that, there are only 2 letters in the alphabet that have just one Kentucky Derby winner each. One of them is the letter U, which stands for unbridled. Now, while he technically does represent the letter U by default, he does represent it quite well. He won the race impressively, and gave us one of the most heartwarming moments in the Kentucky Derby's history, as his trainer, Carl Natsker, called the race for unbridled elderly owner Mrs. Genter, who couldn't see the race very well. And as well as that, Unbridled was a pretty talented horse in his own right. While he more frequently finished second and third in major races, he still won both the Kentucky Derby and the Breeders' Cup Classic in the same year, and also took the Deputy Minister handicap, which I think is his most underappreciated victory, because both the Derby and the Breeders' Cup Classic were 1.25 mile races, but the Deputy Minister was a 7-furlong sprint. Despite the shortened distance, he showed an incredible turn of foot, and even defeated Housebuster, who is a Hall of Fame sprinter. A versatile runner with a heartwarming story and a great influence as a stallion, Unbridled represents the letter U quite nicely. For the letter V, there isn't really much competition, just 2 horses. One was Venetian Way, who won the Derby in 1960 and also made a cameo in a Stephen King novel, and the other one is the one we're going to pick, going way back in time to just the second running of the Kentucky Derby. V is for Vagrant. Now, there ain't really much in the way of photographs or information on this horse considering he raced in 1876, but we do know this. He was the first gelding to win the Kentucky Derby, the unofficial champion 2- and 3-year-old of 1875 and 1876 respectively, and during his long career, which lasted 88 races, he won exactly 20. A great first example of a Kentucky Derby gelding. For letter W, we got some of the best Kentucky Derby winners, such as War Admiral, who will represent this letter. Now, while I personally prefer Whirlaway for his crazy personality, objectively, War Admiral was a significantly better horse. After losing 3 of his first 6 career races, War Admiral only lost twice in his next 20 starts. That's freakish, if you ask me, and that included winning the Triple Crown, as well as basically everything else that wasn't the Pimlico Special against Seabiscuit. That and also a 4th in the Mass Cap as a 4-year-old, but besides that, nobody beat War Admiral. There's a good reason why he was the heavy favorite going into that match race, because he was a significantly better looking horse going into it. And while we all love to have War Admiral as the heel to Seabiscuit's underdog story, at the end of the day, for that story to work, you had to have a horse that looked almost infallible, and that's what War Admiral was. You have to give credit where credit was due. He was a nearly perfect horse, plagued by the irony that if you win almost every time, people are going to remember the few times you lost a lot more. Next, we got a slightly awkward patch. Now, if you remember from the beginning of the video, I said something like this: the best winner from each alphabetical letter. And with 25 of these to cover, I'm not wasting much time. That wasn't me accidentally admitting that I failed kindergarten class. That was me basically alluding to the fact that there is no horse in history who has raced in the Kentucky Derby that started with the letter X. Not a single one. No X's. So we go on to Y, and there are no winners with the letter Y either, so we're gonna have to go with the next best thing. And I had almost nothing to work with. Yankee Notions, the best finisher with the letter Y, has basically no information about him. Yamoka didn't do anything of note, and Your Host is all we got. But on the bright side, even though Your Host only finished 9th in the Kentucky Derby, not exactly a great example for a Kentucky Derby alphabet, he certainly wasn't a bad horse. From birth, he had quite a few difficulties that he was able to overcome, such as a crooked neck and a right eye and ear that were set higher than his left, as well as 2 graces with death, one as a 2-year-old and one at the end of his career. However, in between those, he was able to win 13 of 23 starts, which included the Santa Catalina Handicap, which he won under 130 pounds after his jockey's saddle slipped. And that was just his gutsiest race. He had 9 other stakes races to his name. But after his second grace with death, after falling in the San Pasqual Handicap, he was put out to stud, lived to the age of 15, and produced Kelso, the greatest gelding ever to exist. So, while he finished 9th in the Kentucky Derby, with literally no other options to go with, he'll have to do. And now we've finally made it. The last letter of the alphabet. And there is only one Kentucky Derby winner that starts with this letter. Last but certainly not least, Z stands for Zev. When Zev finally retired at the age of 4, he was the richest horse in the world, and the horse he had taken it away from was Man o' War. The way he was able to out-earn Man o' War was mainly thanks to an incredible 3-year-old season. In 14 starts that year, he won 12 of them, winning the Kentucky Derby, the Belmont Stakes, as well as a laundry list of other races, as well as not one, but 2 separate match races against 2 separate champions. First, he faced off against the Epsom Derby winner Papyrus in a race that would draw 50,000 people. It wasn't really a contest. Zev won by 5 lengths easily. His second match race was a lot harder, facing off against In Memoriam, a horse that had beaten him 2 weeks prior. And even to this day, it ain't really clear who wins this race. While Zev was declared the winner of this match race, you can't truly tell because this was before photo finish cameras existed. Regardless, that season alone puts him on the same leg as some of the other greats from the 1920s, such as Man o' War, Greylag, Exterminator, and Sarazen. And while he technically doesn't have any competition for it, Zev represents letter Z in the Kentucky Derby winner's alphabet beautifully. And that, my friends, is the Kentucky Derby winner's alphabet in its entirety. And it was a long one. If you watched this whole video, I commend you. If you did, comment down the word Zev to prove you watched the whole thing. Anyways, with that done, all that's really left to do is just recap the Kentucky Derby alphabet in less than a minute. So, here it is. A is for affirmed, B for Big Brown, C for citation, D for determine, E for exterminator, F for foolish pleasure, G for gallant fox, H for Hindu, I is for I'll have another, J is for justify, K is for Kawaii King, L is for Leonatus, M is for majestic prince, N is for northern dancer, O is for Omaha, P is for ponder, Q is for quadrangle, R is for Riva Ridge, S is for secretariat, T is for Tim Tam, U is for unbridled, V is for vagrant, W is for War Admiral, X is for nobody, Y is for your host, and Z is for Zev. And now you know your Kentucky Derby winner, ABCs. Make sure to have a good 148th Kentucky Derby, y'all, and I'll see you guys on the flip side.